Ah yes, Ed, Ed, and Eddy, the show about three guys with the same name who go about scamming kids out of their cash in hopes of buying jawbreakers. You wouldn't think a show like that would be very popular. Well, surprisingly it was. Ed, Ed, and Eddy, along with Dexter's Laboratory and the Powerpuff Girls, was one of those beloved series in Cartoon Network's Cartoon lineup. It actually wound up being among Cartoon Network's longest-running programs. In spite of its success, however, Ed, Ed, and Eddy hasn't garnered as much critical acclaim as those other two shows have. Opinions on the show have varied. I know some people who really like it and find it great, and others who absolutely despise it and can't understand why people enjoy it. I give you my opinions in these videos on animation and review, so you'll be finding that out as we go along. The things that make Ed, Ed, and Eddy unique among the cartoons are also some of the points of contention among its detractors. Those things include the characters, the style, and to an extent the storylines. Examining each of these facets in detail, I hope to give you my own assessment of this show. So, let's dive in and see what the Ed's world is like.
Huh? Wrong cartoon.
Yeah, sorry. Ed, Ed, and Eddy features a diverse but limited number of characters. The main focus was kids, primarily the three Eds. The Eds are as different from each other in terms of personality as the directions on a compass. Ed, the biggest of the three, is the lovable, large dimwit who provides much of the comedy for the show. His superhuman strength is used to the Eds' advantage with their scams, but his clumsiness often causes said scams to fail. Many times his dialogue has little to do with the current situation, but what he says often gets the biggest laugh.
A good buttock finds its own bench, Eddy.
An elephant never forgets, but I forget what the elephant remembered. Without the bun, a sausage has no home!
There's quite a charm to him, despite his less than appealing hygiene. Ed, called Double D to differentiate him from the Ed mentioned previously, is quite the opposite of his lumbering counterpart. He is a meticulous intellectual with an apt for inventing. His technical expertise makes him useful in designing the scams dreamt up by Eddy. What he says is often too complicated for the Eds, and most likely the viewers, to understand, but he is probably the most sympathetic and relatable of the three Eds. Then there's Eddy, the leader of the trio, a diminutive loudmouth with a large ego whose love of cash keeps the Eds scamming. His relationship with Ed and Double D appears to be more that of a partnership than a mutual friendship. If there's any way to be the center of attention, Eddy's there. He's, without a doubt, the least likable of the three main characters. His delight lies in conning the neighborhood kids out of their loose change through whatever scam he can concoct. In addition to the three Ed boys, 6 other kids inhabit the cul-de-sac the Eds call home. These other kids on the show are a handful of diverse individuals, each with their own set of quirks. The personalities of these characters are all over the map. There's Rolf, a foreign immigrant with unusual customs and many animals. Johnny, a rather eccentric boy who hangs around with a wooden board named Plank. Sarah, Ed's bratty and domineering little sister, and quite a few others. The relationships between each of these kids and the Eds can vary. Some of them will enjoy or at least tolerate the Eds, while others will ostracize and scorn them for being there. Then there are the Canker sisters, who are probably the least appealing characters on the show. These 3 girls live in a trailer park and have deep infatuations with the 3 Eds. Most of their screen time is taken up with harassing the Eds, or the other kids in some cases, and assaulting them with as much physical passion as a TV Y7 rating will allow them to get away with. They really don't have any redeeming traits to speak of. They kind of just exist to make the lives of the others a living hell. In many cases, they seem to be forced into episodes just to make the Eds lose. Like when Eddy learns that his ancestors founded the town of Peach Creek in which the kids live and is milking it to get the other kids to respect him. The Canker sisters show up just to inform the Eds that Eddy's ancestors lost the land to the Cankers' ancestors. Then the Eds get assaulted and episode over. Yeah, I get they want to make the Eds lose here, but this is just not good writing to have the story just hastily wrapped up like that. To be fair, the Kanker sisters don't live as close to the neighborhood as the other kids, and so their screen time is fairly limited by comparison. Depending on how you look at them, the Eds and the other kids can either be enjoyable or irritating. You can't really expect to consistently sympathize with any one of them. Even characters of a more sympathetic nature, like Jimmy, the accident-prone boy with a large retainer who hangs out with Sarah, and Double D, have had instances where they've done things that are underhanded or just aggravating. I believe the show's intent is not to be a squeaky clean, morally upright show. The children showcased aren't meant to be the best kinds of kids in the world. They can be mean or irritating, as children are known to be sometimes. In this way, I think that the show is being pretty true to life, showing that things don't always work out the way you want them to, and there are times when it all can come crashing down on you. The Eds and company inhabit quite an interesting world, a world that's rather sparsely populated. Only 12 characters in total are ever fully seen on screen over the course of the show's run. There's never a crowd scene where other minor characters appear, and although adults are mentioned throughout the series, they are never fully visible either. Even in the later seasons of the show, when the Eds were relocated to school, we never see anyone other than the dozen kids that were already present in the first few seasons. This makes for a shockingly isolated world for Ed, Edd, and Eddy. It makes you wonder why no other kids ever show up. I've heard fan theories spring up that suggest that either the cul-de-sac is like some sort of purgatory, or that every character is the embodiment of a dead kid or something. Such topics don't interest me, so I'm not going to discuss them. But I think the show was trying to have a similar perspective to that of Peanuts, in that everything is seen from a child's point of view. Of course, Ed, Edd, and Eddy never got deep and philosophical like the kids in Peanuts did. It was more focused on absurdist situations and comedy. Having that quality makes Ed, Edd, and Eddy most appealing to kids. It kind of had a unique style all its own. Among the shows that made up Cartoon Network's cartoon block, Ed, Edd, and Eddy was rather unique in terms of style. Looking at the show in comparison to, say, Johnny Bravo or one of the other cartoons, you'll notice that there's something quite a bit different about Ed, Edd, and Eddy. The backgrounds, while detailed, are not sharply colored like they are in other cartoons, and the characters don't appear to be as solid as the characters in the other shows. Over the course of an episode, they can take on quite uncanny forms and over-the-top expressions. Most noticeable of all are the outlines. Instead of being flush with a character's shape, the outlines in Ed, Edd, and Eddy appear to wiggle against the scenery. This is most noticeable when the characters are standing still. The reasons for these differences mainly lie in the way that the show was produced. Showrunner Danny Antonucci was a huge fan of hand-drawn animation. In making Ed, Edd, and Eddy, he wanted to pay homage to the cartoons of the mid-20th century. Thus, Ed, Edd, and Eddy was completely hand-drawn, utilizing cell animation for its first 4 seasons. With the boiling outlines, Antonucci wanted to give the characters a sense of liveliness and a unique design in contrast to other cartoons. This style gives Ed, Edd, and Eddy a sort of otherworldly feel. If you watch an episode of the show, you'll soon learn that it's not just the outlines that give these characters a liveliness. The action on the show allows the Eds and the other characters to exhibit quite a bit of flexibility. If you take an introductory animation course, one of the topics you're bound to cover is squash and stretch. This principle gives life to animated drawings by granting them a supple and realistic sense of motion. In Ed, Edd, and Eddy, the squash and stretch principle seems to be turned up to 11 in more than a few places. The characters are able to morph beyond realistic proportions to create bizarre situations. Making things more bizarre were the sound effects. In Ed, Edd, and Eddy, the use of sound was quite unconventional. What you would hear in a given situation would not often be what you'd expect. The call of a lamb could be heard when a package was pulled out of a mailbox, or a flushing toilet would sound when sauce was added to a pizza. If the world of the Eds could be studied physically, there's no telling what kind of research topics could be gleaned from it. The showrunners seemed to be aware of this, as one episode showcased a broken reality being observed by the Eds. While this manic style was funny, it became rather exhausting in later years of the show. In episodes of Seasons 4, and especially Seasons 5 and 6, it seemed like the show couldn't go 5 seconds without some over-the-top action or bizarre facial expression occurring. For me, stuff like this is only funny in small doses. When it consistently happens throughout an episode, it feels like you're watching a kid on a sugar rush and waiting for him to settle down. Imagine that the coyote in the Roadrunner Wile E. Coyote shorts got blown up every time he took 3 steps. That's kind of the effect this has. What I'm getting at is that there's more to being a kid's cartoon than just a bunch of extreme actions and weirdness. There's humor in them, yes, but there's humor in other things too. Of course, in talking about the show's style, I know that it's all a matter of taste. The style of Ed, Edd, and Eddy is one which I know wouldn't appeal to everyone. And I get it. There are popular cartoons that have art styles I don't really like, but I can look past that and see the appeal of them, and there was quite an appeal to Ed, Edd, and Eddy. I saw clips from an episode being used in Disney's The Kid, so it was quite a popular attraction. It was just a different show with its own stories to tell. Each episode of Ed, Edd, and Eddy focused on the misadventures experienced by the 3 Eds. Typical plotlines involved either A, watching the Eds find a way to con the neighborhood kids, B, watching the Eds try to become popular with the other kids in some way, or C, some other venture that usually ended up failing for the Eds. So seeing a happy ending for all 3 Eds was a genuine rarity during the show's run. Because of their involvement with Eddy's schemes, Ed and Double D often find themselves guilty by association, suffering the same degree of disgrace as Eddy at the conclusion of the episodes. Most of the time the punishment was justified, especially if it was Eddy on the receiving end of it. Sometimes not so much. There have been several episodes that have drawn the ire of fans for putting the wrong character or characters on the receiving end of punishments. To be fair, I don't really like these episodes either, but these are minor missteps in an otherwise great show. More often than not, the show knew who deserved karmic punishment in each episode. Even if they didn't technically deserve the same humiliation as Eddy, Ed and Double D never usually went out of their way to make things much better, so you don't normally feel too much sympathy towards them. In a way, the show did try and illustrate the offbeat nature of a person's youth. Episodes typically began with something taking place that didn't have much to do with the overall story, but eventually segued into it after a minute or so. Creator Danny Antonucci called this his way of illustrating the randomness of childhood. In that way, it did connect with people who remember the crazy things they did as kids. There might be something in an Ed, Edd, and Eddy episode that's bound to tickle your nostalgia bone if you're an adult. I can see someone looking at the Ed's activities and saying, hey, that's something I remember doing as a kid. For those who are just kids, the show is just pure laughter and fun. The Ed's influence over the series extended to the titles as well. Episode titles were usually expressions or something that had a word replaced with the name Ed. So there were titles like Over Your Ed, Ed and a Half Shell, Ed Overboard, and so on. These titles, while occasionally clever, didn't really give an indication as to what each episode was about. Thus, it's probably better to refer to episodes by their plot summaries rather than their titles. Whatever their adventures were called, Ed and Eddy always had some entertaining tale to showcase. Their antics and differing reactions to whatever circumstances befell them provided some of the stimulating dynamics that made the show a fun watch. I guess you could say it was a rather spirit Ed comedy. Sorry. All in all, Ed, Edd and Eddy was quite a unique show for a variety of reasons. But the things that set it apart from other Cartoon Network shows were also sort of things that turned people off of it. Where great cartoon series are concerned, Ed, Edd and Eddy is generally overlooked by most critics. It's not beyond my understanding as to why this is. The style of the show was rather uncanny in comparison to the other cartoons airing at the time. The jittery outlines and random sound effects were ways in which the show violated traditional cartoon style. The characters lacked emotional depth and could be rather abrasive at times. And I suppose it could also be argued that their strange stories in the realms of fantasy have been done to better effect by other cartoons. In spite of all this, Ed, Edd and Eddy has remained among the best remembered Cartoon Network series. For all their bumbling silliness and insane hijinks, the Eds did make children and even some adults laugh. If that was what the show set out to do above all else, then it very well succeeded. So, my opinion of the show is that I thought it was funny. It had some memorable moments and episodes that I still remember fondly. I laughed quite a bit watching it. I would personally stick with the earlier seasons that take place during the summer, as those are more fresh and enjoyable. It's not a perfect show by any means, but it's an imaginative and energetic look at the world through the eyes of three weird young men. It entertained kids and some adults too. The world of the Eds was a fascinating one to see throughout its 130 episodes, 4 specials, and TV movie. Oh, that's one thing I forgot to mention. The show ended its run in 2009 with a TV movie called Ed, Edd and Eddy's Big Picture Show. It sent the show off on a high note and provided satisfying closure to a show that had captured the delight of youngsters for a decade. You could say it really let the characters Ed off into the sunset in glorious fashion. I'm sorry, that was terrible. But if you're interested in watching the show, there are DVD collections available for the series, and I believe you can get it on Amazon Prime as well.